They say that silence is golden, but they forget to mention that gold can be melted down, forged in fire, and shaped into the sharpest of weapons. In a house where genuine laughter was a currency they could never afford, the silence of a child became something else entirely. It became a promise, a quiet, patient vow that a storm was gathering, far off on the horizon, waiting for the perfect moment to break. For 15 years, that storm had gathered strength, and today, it had finally come ashore. Her name was Evelyn Reed now, a name as sleek and cold as the polished steel of the city skyline she dominated. But as she sat in the silent, leather-clad interior of her car, she remembered being a girl named Alara Vance. She watched as a man in a cheap suit hammered a new sign into the manicured lawn of the grand Vance estate, the sharp thud of the hammer echoing like a gavel calling a long-overdue court to session. The cheerful red of the for sale sign was unceremoniously pulled down, replaced by a single, brutal word: sold. The real estate agent, a man named Miller who had been sweating nervously for the past hour, approached her window. He held a small, velvet box with trembling hands. Evelyn lowered the tinted window just enough, and the crisp autumn air filled the car, carrying with it the scent of dying leaves, a fitting perfume for the day. He didn't dare meet her eyes. "Miss Reed," he stammered, "the keys. The property is officially yours." Evelyn took the box, her gloved fingers brushing his. He flinched as if her touch was electric. She offered no smile, no word of thanks. She simply stared at the house, her house now. It was more than brick and mortar to her. It was a museum of pain, a monument to a betrayal so profound it had carved out the girl she was and left a woman made of ice and ambition. In her mind's eye, she was 16 again, standing in that very living room, the damask wallpaper, a witness to her silent tears. She could still see the strained, desperate smiles on her parents' faces, David and Eleanor Vance, as they explained her duty to the family. They spoke of sacrifice and honor, but their eyes spoke only of bank statements and social status. They hadn't arranged a marriage, they had brokered a sale. The commodity was their daughter, and the buyer was a man 30 years her senior, a man whose name was a synonym for power and control. Evelyn closed her eyes for a brief moment, the memory a ghost she had learned to command. When she opened them, the cold resolve had returned. She wasn't just buying a house. She was purchasing a stage, the perfect stage for the final act of a play she had been writing for 15 years. And her parents, the architects of her suffering, were about to become the lead actors. They just didn't know it yet. To understand the revenge, you must first understand the lie, and the lie of the Vance family was a masterpiece. It was a grand, sprawling epic, told not in words, but in marble floors and crystal chandeliers, in the casual elegance of garden parties and the clinking of champagne glasses at charity galas, where more was spent on canapés than ever reached the cause. Their home, a Georgian-style mansion nestled in the green hills of Connecticut, wasn't a home at all. It was a stage, meticulously designed for an audience of the envious. Every morning, the illusion was carefully reconstructed. The scent of Eleanor's expensive French perfume would mix with the sharp, clean smell of the housekeeper's lemon polish, creating an atmosphere of sterile wealth. This was the world Alara grew up in, a world where appearances were not just everything, they were the only thing. At the center of this performance was her father, David Vance. He was a man who had fallen in love with his own reflection in the stock market ticker. In his mahogany-paneled study, surrounded by leather-bound books he'd never read, he would command his universe through a series of bold, aggressive trades. He saw himself as a titan, a predator in a world of sheep, and he spoke of the market with a lover's passion. He preached the gospel of high risk, high reward, ignoring the simple truth that the higher you fly, the further you have to fall. Alara would often see him staring at the glowing green and red numbers on his screen, a triumphant smirk on his face after a successful day, a look not of contentment, but of a gambler who had just won another reprieve from his debts. He was generous with the fruits of these victories, but his generosity was a performance. He didn't give gifts, he bestowed artifacts of his success, each one a testament to his own perceived brilliance. His wife, Eleanor, was the high priestess of this religion of appearances. Her domain was society. Her days were a whirlwind of calls to caterers, florists, and the heads of various committees. She collected important friends the way others collected art, valuing them for how they looked hanging on her arm at a public event. Her love for her children was filtered through this lens of public perception. Marcus, her son, was her masterpiece. He was handsome, charismatic, and effortlessly arrogant, the perfect heir to a throne that didn't truly exist. Eleanor doted on him, praised his every minor achievement, and shielded him from any hint of consequence. He was the golden boy, destined for greatness simply because she had declared it so. A new sports car for his 18th birthday, a European tour after graduation, a generous allowance to fund a series of business ventures that never seemed to materialize. Nothing was too good for Marcus, because his success was a direct reflection of her own. And then there was Ilara. If Marcus was the sun in the Vance family solar system, Ilara was the distant, quiet planet nobody ever thought to look for. She was intelligent, observant, and cursed with a pragmatism that was utterly alien in her own home. While her mother taught her which fork to use for the fish course, Ilara taught herself how to read a balance sheet. While her father boasted of his market conquests, Ilara would slip into his study late at night. She wouldn't look at the glowing screens of triumph, but at the locked drawer in his desk. She had picked the lock years ago, not out of malice, but out of a desperate need for the truth. In that drawer, beneath the glossy, fabricated reports he showed to his bankers, was the real story. A second set of ledgers, a terrifying mountain of credit card statements, and letters from lenders that grew increasingly less polite. She saw the chasm widening between the life they lived and the money they had. She saw that her father wasn't a titan. He was an addict, chasing the high of a market win to pay the interest on the last loss. She saw that her mother's social standing was a house of cards built on a foundation of debt. She saw her brother, Marcus, happily siphoning funds from a well he believed was bottomless, oblivious, and entitled. The beautiful lie was a terminal illness, and Ilara was the only one in the family who could see the diagnosis. She tried to be the voice of reason, once. At a family dinner celebrating another of David's supposed windfalls, she gently questioned the wisdom of buying a new racehorse for Marcus. "I was just looking at the household accounts," she began softly, "and it seems like we have a lot of overhead right now. Perhaps we could wait on the horse?" The reaction was immediate and absolute. The air grew cold. Her father set down his wineglass with a sharp click. "Ilara," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "when you have a degree from Wharton and manage a multi-million-dollar portfolio, you can give me your opinion. Until then, leave the grown-up decisions to me." Eleanor looked at her, as if she had uttered a curse. "What a dreadful thing to say," she hissed, her voice a low whisper of pure horror. "You make us sound too poor. Never ever speak of household accounts at the dinner table again. What if the staff hears you?" Marcus just laughed, a cruel, dismissive sound. "Always the little killjoy, aren't you, sis? Don't worry, Dad's got it. He always does." She was silenced, dismissed, and branded a pessimist. After that, she never tried again. She simply watched, and she learned, and she recorded every crack in the gilded facade. The cracks began to spread. There was the time Eleanor's credit card was declined at a charity auction, a moment of public humiliation so profound that she didn't leave her room for 2 days. The official story was a banking error. Ilara knew it wasn't. There were the hushed, frantic phone calls David started taking in his locked study, his voice tight with a fear she had never heard before. There was the quiet sale of a Monet painting from the West Wing, explained away as making room for a new piece, though a new piece never arrived. Each event was a small tremor, signaling the earthquake to come. Through it all, Marcus remained blissfully unaware, spending his days at the country club, charming the daughters of his father's associates, secure in his position as the chosen one. Ilara, meanwhile, continued her silent vigil. She lived in the heart of the lie, yet she was the only one who lived in the truth. She watched her family dance on the edge of a cliff, drunk on champagne and denial, and a cold certainty began to settle in her heart. When they finally fell, they would not fall alone. They would reach out and pull someone down with them to break their fall. She just didn't yet realize that she was the one they intended to sacrifice. The end of the lie did not come with a whisper, but with a roar. It was the sound of the stock market crashing on a Tuesday in October, a digital tsunami that wiped out the last vestiges of David Vance's paper fortune. The news channels called it a market correction. For the Vances, it was an extinction-level event. The frantic, high-interest loans David had taken out to cover his previous losses were all called in at once. The wolves were no longer at the door. They were in the foyer, tearing the furniture apart. The illusion shattered overnight. The housekeeping staff was let go first, their absence announced by a thin layer of dust that began to settle on every polished surface, a fine gray snow of failure. The heating was lowered until the grand rooms of the mansion felt like a mausoleum, cold and silent. David, once so bombastic and proud, became a ghost haunting his own home, his face pale, his eyes hollow. Eleanor's carefully constructed composure crumbled into a quiet, simmering hysteria. She would pace the long hallways, her hands clenched, muttering about guest lists for parties that would never happen again. Marcus, for the first time in his life, was confronted with a reality his charm couldn't fix, and he retreated into a sullen, resentful silence. The magnificent stage was now a tomb, and they were all trapped inside. Into this tomb walked Alistair Sterling. He didn't knock. He arrived, his presence announced by the crunch of his limousine's tires on the gravel driveway. He was a man who seemed to defy age. Though he was in his late 60s, he stood with the straight-backed posture of a military man. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, were sharp and missed nothing. He wore a bespoke suit that probably cost more than the Vances' remaining assets. He was one of David's oldest business contacts, a man who had watched David's reckless ascent and predicted his spectacular fall. He was not there to offer condolences, he was there to collect. Elara watched from the top of the grand staircase as her parents met him in the foyer. It was a picture of a total power shift. David and Eleanor, who had once held court in this very hall, now looked like humble servants petitioning a king. They ushered Sterling into the study, the door closing with a heavy final thud. Elara wasn't invited. She was merely the subject of the negotiation. For 2 hours, she waited, the muffled sounds of conversation rising and falling, the only sound in the dead quiet house. When the study door finally opened, Alistair Sterling strode out, his face impassive. He paused at the bottom of the stairs and looked directly up at Elara. It was not a lecherous gaze, but something far more unsettling. It was the look of a collector appraising a piece he was about to acquire. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, then turned and left. That evening, her parents summoned her to the formal living room. A fire had been lit in the hearth, a weak attempt to feign warmth and normalcy. David stood before the mantel, trying to summon the last dregs of his patriarchal authority. Eleanor sat ramrod straight on the velvet sofa, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Marcus slouched in an armchair, pointedly avoiding Elara's gaze. "Elara," David began, his voice strained, "we have some wonderful news. Truly incredible news." Elara waited, a cold knot of dread tightening in her stomach. "You know Mr. Sterling," he continued, "a pillar of the community, a man of immense wealth and influence. He holds our family in very high regard." He paused, clearing his throat. So high, in fact, that he has made a most generous proposal. He has asked for your hand in marriage. The words hung in the air, unreal and monstrous. Elara felt the blood drain from her face. "Marriage?" she whispered, the word feeling foreign on her tongue. I don't understand. I've never even spoken to him." Eleanor leaned forward, forcing a brittle smile. "It's an alliance, darling. A union between two important families. Mr. Sterling has been a widower for some time. He desires a companion, and he's chosen you." Elara stared at them, her mind struggling to process the sheer audacity of it. "He's older than you, Dad," she said, her voice trembling. "This is insane. You can't be serious." David's facade of civility cracked. "Serious? This is our salvation. Alistair Sterling is prepared to absorb every penny of our debt. Every single creditor will be paid off. This house, our name, our future, he's offering to save it all." Now the truth was laid bare. This wasn't a proposal, it was a price. Her price. "So you're selling me," she said, the words tasting like poison. "You're selling me to him to pay your bills." The accusation hit Eleanor like a physical blow. "How dare you?" she shrieked, her voice thin and sharp with fury. "After everything we've given you? This beautiful home, the finest schools, a life of privilege. We are asking you to do one thing, one single thing to ensure this family survives. And you call it selling?" Alara turned to her father, her eyes pleading. "Dad, please, there has to be another way. We can sell the house, downsize. I can get a job. We can work through this together." David shook his head, a look of pity and disgust on his face. "You don't understand the world, Alara. Selling this house is admitting defeat. It's public ruin. This way, nothing has to change. Our standing remains. Marcus's future is secure." In a final, desperate act, she turned to her brother. "Marcus, say something, please. Tell them this is wrong." Marcus shifted in his chair, unable to meet her desperate gaze. He mumbled, "Sterling is a very powerful man, Alara. This could be a good thing for us. For you. You'd never have to worry about money again." And in that moment, she understood. She was completely, utterly alone. They were united against her. She was not a daughter or a sister. She was a lifeline they were all clinging to, and they didn't care if she drowned as long as they were pulled to shore. She looked back at her mother, who was now regarding her with cold, hard eyes. The final, killing blow came from her. "Stop this foolish, selfish display, Alara," Eleanor said, her voice devoid of any warmth. "This is your duty to this family." Duty. The word echoed in the sudden silence of the room. It was the moment the girl named Alara Vance died. The love she had for them, the hope she held that they could be a real family, all of it shriveled into a cold, dark ember in her chest. She stopped pleading. She stopped crying. A profound, terrifying calm washed over her. She looked at the three people who were supposed to protect her, who had instead just signed her bill of sale. She gave them a single, slow nod. "Fine," she said, her voice unnervingly steady. "I'll do my duty." She then turned, without another word, and walked out of the room, leaving them with their victory. As she climbed the stairs to her bedroom, she didn't feel like she was walking. She felt like she was floating away from her own body, watching a stranger take her place, a stranger being led to the slaughter. The transaction was complete. The wedding was not a celebration of love. It was the ratification of a treaty. Held in the sterile, cavernous ballroom of a downtown hotel, it was an event marked by opulence and a profound lack of joy. Alara moved through the day like a specter in a ridiculously expensive couture gown, a ghost at her own funeral. Alistair Sterling stood beside her, a pillar of quiet satisfaction, accepting the congratulations of his peers, who all knew the true nature of the arrangement, but were too polite to say so. The most surreal moment was seeing her family. Her father, David, was once again playing the role of the proud patriarch, laughing a little too loudly, his relief palpable. Her mother, Eleanor, drifted through the crowd, radiant, soaking in the reflected glory of the Sterling name, her social status not just saved, but elevated. Marcus was there, already talking to Alistair's bankers about securing seed money for his next grand idea. They would occasionally glance at Alara, offering her a thumbs up or a triumphant smile, as if she had just won a prize, not been sold to the highest bidder. She was their salvation, and they had come to celebrate her sacrifice. Her new home, the Sterling estate on Long Island Sound, made the Vance mansion look like a quaint country cottage. It was a sprawling limestone fortress, filled with priceless art and an oppressive, museum-like silence. And it was here, within these gilded walls, that Alara learned the true meaning of imprisonment. Alistair's control was absolute, executed not with anger or shouting, but with the cold, unyielding efficiency of a corporate takeover. Her life was governed by a daily schedule, printed out by Alistair's personal assistant and left on her bedside table each morning. It dictated her meal times, her appointments for fittings with designers, and the charity events she was required to attend at his side. She was given an allowance, but it was on a credit card that required itemized receipts for every purchase, which were then reviewed by Alistair's accountant. It wasn't about the money, it was about the monitoring. Her isolation was methodical and complete. The phone in her suite could only make outgoing calls with the operator's assistance, and she knew every call was logged. Her old friends from school tried to reach out in the beginning, but their calls were never put through, their invitations politely declined by staff on her behalf. Her family was allowed to visit once a month for a supervised Sunday brunch that was an agonizing exercise in performance. They would sit in the formal dining room, making cheerful small talk under Alistair's watchful gaze, never once asking her if she was happy. They didn't want to know. The truth would have tarnished the beautiful price of their freedom. During these visits, they would boast of their return to form. The country club membership renewed. Marcus's new tech startup, funded by a generous gift from his new brother-in-law. Eleanor's latest charity auction triumph. They saw her gilded cage and mistook it for a paradise, because they needed to. To admit otherwise would be to admit their own monstrosity. For the first year, Alara simply endured. She was a phantom in her own life, a beautifully dressed doll who ate when she was told, slept when she was told, and smiled when she was told. Her grief was a constant, heavy cloak she couldn't take off. But then came the turning point. It wasn't a single dramatic event, but a slow, dawning realization during one of those excruciating family brunches. As she watched her brother laugh about crashing his new car, knowing Alistair would simply buy him another, and saw her parents looking at her with vacant, satisfied eyes, something inside her shifted. The grief, so long a passive, sorrowful weight, began to burn. It curdled into a cold, hard rage. They expected her to break. Alistair expected her to be a docile, empty-headed ornament. Her family expected her to be grateful. And in that moment she decided she would be none of those things. She would not give them the satisfaction of her destruction. Her prison had one weakness, one loophole in Alistair's total control: his library. It was his one true passion, a 2-story rotunda with floor-to-ceiling shelves, containing thousands of books on every conceivable subject. He saw it as a monument to his own intellect, and he never imagined it could be used as an armory against him. For Alistair, a woman reading was a harmless pastime. It kept her quiet, so he let her be. At first, Alara read to escape, losing herself in fiction and poetry. But soon, her anger gave her a new purpose. She started to study her jailer. She began with the books in his own study, the ones with broken spines and dog-eared pages. Books on economics, corporate law, market theory, hostile takeovers, and negotiation tactics. The words were a foreign language at first, but she was a desperate and intelligent student. She devoured them, cross-referencing theories, writing secret notes in a cipher of her own invention, hiding them in the hollowed-out backs of old novels. Her life took on a new, secret rhythm. By day, she was the placid Mrs. Sterling. By night, she was a scholar of power. The business dinners she had once dreaded became her most important lectures. She would sit at Alistair's side, a picture of quiet elegance, and she would listen. Before, the talk of mergers, acquisitions, and leveraged buyouts had been meaningless noise. Now, she understood. She recognized the strategies from the pages of the books she read at night. She analyzed the men at the table, noting their weaknesses, their egos, their tells. She learned that the world of high finance wasn't about numbers, it was about psychology, about finding your opponent's fear and squeezing it. She studied Alistair most of all. She learned how he used silence as a weapon, how he pitted his rivals against each other, how he built empires by exploiting the debt of others. He was a master, and in his arrogance, he was giving his most dedicated student a private, multi-year education in his own dark arts. He mistook her focused silence for submission, never realizing she was absorbing his every move, filing away his every tactic. The gilded cage was supposed to be the end of her story. Instead, it became her crucible. The lonely, heartbroken girl who had walked into it was being burned away, and from the ashes, a woman of tempered steel was being forged. She was learning that true power wasn't about the money you had, but the knowledge you possessed, and she was quietly, patiently, amassing a fortune. The end of Alistair Sterling's reign came as quietly as the turning of a page. There was no dramatic illness, no lengthy goodbye. He was simply found one morning by his butler, slumped over the massive oak desk in his study, a cold cup of tea at his elbow, and the Financial Times still open in his hands. A massive, silent coronary event had claimed him in the night. He had lived his life like a king, but he died like a clerk, alone with his paperwork. When the news was brought to Alara, she felt a profound and unsettling stillness. There was no grief, for there had been no love. But there was no joy either. For 5 years, her entire existence had been defined by the gravitational pull of this one man. He was her north, her south, her east, and her west. He was the walls of her prison, and now he was gone. The silence he left behind was louder than any noise he had ever made. She was a prisoner who had awoken to find the door of her cell unlocked and the guard gone. The sudden, infinite possibility of freedom was not exhilarating, it was terrifying. Her family's arrival was a storm of performative sorrow and barely concealed panic. They swept into the estate within hours of hearing the news. Eleanor dressed in dramatic black, dabbing at perfectly dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. "My poor, dear Alara," she cried, embracing her daughter with a theatrical flourish. "To be a widow at your age. That poor, dear man, taken from us so soon." David was more practical, his face a mask of feigned solemnity as he tried to subtly ask the estate manager about the continuity of Alistair's business affairs. Marcus followed them like a lost puppy, his primary concern etched on his face. The flow of money that funded his lifestyle had just been cut off at the source. They hovered around Alara, treating her not as a grieving widow, but as a conduit to the sterling fortune. Their concern wasn't for her, but for their own precarious future. They saw her as their link, their claim, their last hope. The day of the will reading was a masterpiece of tension. They gathered in the top-floor conference room of Alistair's legal firm, a sterile glass box overlooking the city. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and quiet greed. Besides Alara and her family, several of Alistair's distant cousins and long-serving business lieutenants were present, each one hoping for a substantial piece of the empire. Alara sat perfectly still, an island of calm in a sea of anxiety. Her family flanked her, a physical display of their assumed inheritance, whispering useless comforts to her while their eyes darted around the room, sizing up the competition. They believed that she, the quiet, ornamental wife, would be given a comfortable but controlled trust fund, and that the bulk of the estate would be managed by a board they fully intended to influence through her. The lawyer, a severe man named Mr. Harrison, began to read the last will and testament of Alistair Sterling in a dry monotone. The document was ruthlessly efficient, much like the man who had written it. A few generous, but not extravagant, bequests were made to his household staff. A small collection of art was donated to a museum. The distant cousins were left a token amount, enough to dismiss them but not enough to be worth a legal challenge. The room grew colder as each name was read, each hope extinguished. The Vance family leaned in, their collective breath held. This was the moment, and then it came. "All the rest, residue, and remainder of my estate, Mr. Harrison read, his voice unwavering, including all properties real and personal, all shares in Sterling Consolidated, all liquid assets, and all intellectual properties. I give, devise, and bequeath to my beloved wife, Alara Vance Sterling, absolutely and without condition." A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. A stunned silence followed, so profound that Alara could hear the frantic beating of her own heart. She didn't move. She didn't even blink. She simply watched as the truth detonated in the faces of her family. Eleanor's mask of concerned mother-in-law shattered, replaced by a ghastly look of pure, unadulterated shock. David went white, his jaw slack, his eyes wide with a terrifying calculation as he began to comprehend the sheer scale of what his daughter now controlled. And Marcus. Marcus stared at his sister as if she were a complete stranger. The quiet, disposable girl he had grown up with was gone. In her place sat one of the wealthiest and most powerful women in the country. They hadn't just sold their daughter into a gilded cage. They had, in their greed and desperation, handed her an arsenal. After the stunned attendees had been dismissed, Mr. Harrison approached Elara. "There is one more thing, Mrs. Sterling," he said, his professional demeanor softening for the first time. "Mr. Sterling left this for you. For your eyes only." He handed her a thick, cream-colored envelope, sealed with Alistair's personal wax signet. She took it with a steady hand. Later that night, back in the silent fortress of the Sterling estate, Elara went to the one place that felt like hers, the library. With the weight of her new reality settling upon her, she broke the seal on the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of heavy stationery, covered in Alistair's sharp, decisive handwriting. The note was short. "Elara," it began, "I am not a good man, and I was not a good husband, but I am an excellent judge of character. I know what they did to you. I knew it the day I met them. They are weak, vain, and parasitic. They tried to sell you to save themselves from the consequences of their own foolishness. I accepted the deal because I saw in your silence not weakness, but a strength they could never understand. Your 5 years here were not a sentence. They were an apprenticeship. Everything you need to know is in these books. Everything you need to have is now in your name. Don't let them win. The best revenge is not a life well lived, in spite of them. The best revenge is a life of absolute power, lived on your own terms. Now, go and collect your debt." Elara read the note once, twice, 10 times. Each word was a key, unlocking the last 5 years of her life, recasting them in a new, staggering light. The control, the isolation, the endless business dinners. It hadn't been random cruelty. It had been a curriculum, a test. He hadn't just been her jailer. In his own cold, brutal way, he had been her mentor. He hadn't broken her spirit. He had honed it. He had seen the steel beneath her silence and had spent 5 years tempering it in the fires of his own empire. He hadn't given her a cage to die in, but a chrysalis from which she was meant to emerge. And with his final words, he had given her not just his fortune, but his blessing. The confusion that had clouded her heart for years evaporated, replaced by a purpose as cold and clear as a shard of ice. She was no longer Elara Vance, the victim. She was not even Elara Sterling, the widow. She was the inheritor of a legacy of power, and she had a debt to collect. The storm she had promised herself in her childhood silence was finally ready to be unleashed. The world expected Elara Sterling to do one of two things: either collapse under the weight of her newfound fortune, a tragic, beautiful widow overwhelmed by a world she didn't understand, or become a recluse, a modern-day Miss Havisham, rattling around a grand estate, forever haunted by the ghost of her powerful husband. She did neither. The woman who met with Alistair Sterling's board of directors and legal team 1 week after his funeral was not the quiet, demure girl they remembered from corporate dinners. A new stillness had settled upon her, but it was not the stillness of fragility, it was the stillness of a predator. Her eyes, once downcast, were now direct and unnervingly perceptive. She listened for 3 hours as they presented complex charts and offered patronizing advice on how to best manage her new assets, suggesting trusts and oversight committees designed to take control away from her. When they were finished, she didn't ask a single question. She began to issue commands. "Mr. Harrison," she said, her voice calm and even, cutting through the murmuring in the room, "you will begin proceedings to sell the Long Island estate immediately. The same goes for the yacht, the private jet, and the villa in Tuscany. The entire art collection is to be liquidated via private auction within the next quarter." A wave of shock rippled through the room. These were the crown jewels of the Sterling Empire, the very symbols of his power. "Furthermore," she continued, her gaze sweeping over the stunned faces of the board members, "Sterling Consolidated will be rechartered. We will take the company private, effective immediately, under a new holding corporation. I want a 90% liquid capital position within 6 months. You have your instructions." The men, who had walked in expecting to manage a frightened heiress, walked out realizing they were now working for a queen, one whose authority was absolute and whose motives were entirely her own. This was the beginning of Elara's disappearance. She was systematically dismantling the life of Mrs. Alistair Sterling, converting it from tangible assets into pure, untraceable power. The last time she walked through the Long Island mansion, It was being stripped bare by art handlers and auctioneers. She moved through the empty, echoing rooms, her footsteps loud in the silence. This house had been her prison, her university, and her chrysalis. She felt no sentimentality, no attachment. She took nothing with her, no jewelry, no clothes, no mementos. She walked out the front door for the last time, with only the contents of her mind, the most valuable asset Alistair had left her. The world of New York and Connecticut society knew only that the grieving widow had sold everything and vanished, presumably to live a quiet life of solitude abroad. The truth was far more strategic. Alara Vance Sterling ceased to exist. In her place, a new woman arrived in Chicago, a city of cold winds and sharp, ambitious architecture. She chose it for its lack of memory. In Chicago, no one knew the Vance family or the Sterling Empire. It was a city where fortunes were made and lost on merit and nerve, not just old names. And it was here that Evelyn Reed was born. The name was the first part of the construction, Evelyn, for its quiet strength, Reed, for its resilience, its ability to bend in the wind but never break. The physical transformation followed. The long, soft hair of Alara was cut into a sharp, severe bob that framed a face that had become leaner, harder. The bespoke, conservative dresses of Mrs. Sterling were replaced by a wardrobe of architectural precision. Tailored suits in shades of charcoal and black, stark white blouses, and clean, minimalist lines. It was the armor of a modern CEO, designed for efficiency and intimidation, not for social appeal. With her new identity and a significant portion of Alistair's fortune, now sanitized and channeled through a series of discreet Swiss bank accounts, she founded Northbridge Equity Partners. She leased an unassuming office on a high floor of a skyscraper overlooking the river. She hired a small, fiercely loyal team, not from old money networks, but brilliant, hungry outsiders like herself, a data analyst with a gambling addiction he had conquered, a forensic accountant who had been fired from a larger firm for being too aggressive, a lawyer who had grown up in the city's roughest neighborhood. She paid them obscenely well and demanded in return absolute competence and discretion. She was not their friend, she was their commander. They knew her only as Miss Reed, a mysterious figure who seemed to possess an almost supernatural understanding of market dynamics and distressed assets. For the next 10 years, Evelyn Reed worked. Her life became a testament to absolute focus. She rose before the sun, her days a blur of data analysis, financial modeling, and strategic planning. She poured the rage and grief of her past into the furnace of her ambition. She used the tactics Alistair had inadvertently taught her, but with a precision and speed that was all her own. Northbridge didn't just invest, it conquered. Evelyn specialized in finding companies and properties that were on the brink of collapse, much like her family had been, and using her vast capital to acquire them, strip them down, and rebuild them into ruthlessly efficient, profitable enterprises. She became a phantom legend in the financial world, the invisible hand behind some of the decade's most audacious real estate deals. No one saw her face. She conducted her business via secure video calls, her voice always calm, her logic always irrefutable. Her reputation was her shield and her sword. Her personal life was stripped bare. She lived in a minimalist penthouse that felt more like a command center than a home. The walls were white, the furniture was functional, and the few pieces of art were abstract and geometric. The vast windows provided her only decoration, a panoramic, godlike view of the sprawling city below. There were no photographs, no mementos, no clutter from a past she was actively working to erase and rewrite. Her evenings were not spent at galas or restaurants, but in the silence of her apartment, reviewing quarterly reports, the glow of a laptop screen illuminating her focused features. She was not lonely, for she was not alone. She had a constant companion, a cold, patient, and all-consuming purpose. She was not just building an empire, she was forging a weapon. And after a decade of relentless work, the weapon was finally ready. Her fortune now dwarfed Alistair's original legacy. Her power was entirely her own, her new identity unassailable. The girl named Alara was a distant memory. The widow Mrs. Sterling was a historical footnote. Only Evelyn Reed remained. And it was time for Evelyn Reed to turn her gaze eastward, back to a quiet, tree-lined street in Connecticut, back to a grand old house where a debt had been incurred 15 years ago. A debt that was long, long overdue. For 10 years, Evelyn Reed had built her fortress. She had constructed an empire of steel and glass, a financial stronghold so powerful, and a personal identity so anonymous that she was, for all intents and purposes, a ghost. Now, it was time for the ghost to go hunting. From her penthouse office, a sterile glass perch high above the Chicago River, she initiated the first phase of her return. She called it, with a touch of the grim irony she had acquired from Alistair, Project Homecoming. Her first move was to hire the Claiborne Group, a private investigation firm so discreet and so expensive that they didn't have a website, only a number that was passed between billionaires and heads of state. The communication was done through an encrypted channel. Evelyn never showed her face. She was merely a voice, calm and precise, giving an order. "I require a complete workup on the Vance family of Greenwich, Connecticut," she stated. "David, Eleanor, and their son Marcus. I want a full accounting of the last 10 years. Every bank statement, every credit report, every loan application, every social affiliation, every failed business. I want to know who they owe money to, who they pretend to be friends with, and where they buy their groceries. The budget is not a concern. Your only mandate is absolute discretion." 3 weeks later, a courier with the blank, forgettable face of a spy delivered a single, thick, leather-bound dossier to her office. It was heavy in her hands, a 10-year history of decay. She dismissed her staff for the day, locked her office, and in the profound silence, surrounded by the glittering Chicago skyline, Evelyn Reed began to read the story of the family she had left behind. The report was a masterpiece of forensic accounting and covert surveillance, clinical and ruthless. It confirmed everything her cold heart had suspected. Her family had not learned. They had not changed. They had simply decayed. The first section was on her father, David. The photograph clipped to the page showed a man she barely recognized. The proud, arrogant investor was gone, replaced by a stooped figure with a permanent look of frayed anxiety, photographed leaving a high-interest, short-term loan office. The report detailed his journey since Alistair's death had cut off the supply of easy money. He had tried to get back into the market, but the magic was gone. He made a series of disastrously emotional trades, trying to replicate his past glories, and had lost what little capital they had left. From there, he had descended into a spiral of borrowing from increasingly shady sources, each loan taken to cover the interest on the last. He was a man drowning in a sea of his own pride, still telling his few remaining acquaintances at the club bar that he was on the verge of the next big thing. Next was Eleanor. Her section opened with a candid photo of her at a charity luncheon. She was perfectly dressed, her smile rigidly in place, but she was sitting at a table in the back, on the social periphery. She was no longer a queen bee, merely a ghost of glories past. The report detailed how she had desperately tried to maintain the illusion of wealth, quietly selling off the last of her jewelry and couture gowns to consignment shops in the city. Her social circle had shrunk to a handful of other fallen socialites, a circle of women who spent their afternoons drinking white wine and bitterly gossiping about the people who no longer invited them to parties. Her terror, the report noted, was not of poverty, but of irrelevance. She would rather be in debt than be forgotten. The longest section, and the most damning, was on Marcus. The golden boy had tarnished to rust. The report was a litany of failures. The tech startups, funded by Alistair's money, had all imploded within a year, collapsing under the weight of Marcus's incompetence and profligate spending. He had burned through millions, leaving behind a trail of angry investors and unpaid employees. Now, at 35, he was living back at home, a petulant man-child with no job and a mountain of personal debt. He drove a leased sports car he couldn't afford and spent his nights at expensive bars, paying for rounds of drinks with credit cards that were perpetually at their limit. The investigator's summary was brutal. Subject: Marcus Vance is the primary and ongoing catalyst for the family's financial instability. He is a significant and unsustainable drain on their dwindling resources, showing no remorse or intention of changing his behavior. Evelyn closed the dossier. She felt nothing. No pity, no lingering thread of familial affection, not even a spark of anger. What she felt was a cold, grim validation. This was not a family that had fallen on hard times. This was a case study in character. They were exactly who they had always been. A narcissist, a coward, and a leech, all trapped in a codependent cycle of delusion and denial. Their house, the Grand Vance Mansion, was the only thing holding their universe together. The report showed it was mortgaged to the hilt, the bank holding the note growing increasingly impatient with their late payments. It was the keystone of their entire identity, and Evelyn knew that if you wanted to bring down an arch, you removed the keystone. The next day, Evelyn assembled her own team. She projected the contents of the Claiborne dossier onto the large screen in her conference room. "This," she announced, her voice resonating with quiet authority, "is our next acquisition." For the next month, Northbridge Equity Partners moved with silent, surgical precision. Through a labyrinthine series of shell corporations and offshore accounts, Evelyn began her hunt. First, her team approached the regional bank that held the mortgage on the Vance estate. Posing as a foreign investment fund looking to acquire a portfolio of residential debt, they made an offer so far above the mortgage's market value that the bank's board of directors approved the sale in a single afternoon. The ownership of the Vance family home was transferred to a holding company based in the Cayman Islands, a company whose sole owner was Evelyn Reed. Next, they targeted Marcus's debt. His car lease, his maxed-out credit cards, his personal loans, they were all purchased from their respective collection agencies for pennies on the dollar. The agencies were happy to offload the toxic debt of such an unreliable client. Finally, they went after David's private loans. This was more delicate. His creditors were not banks, they were sharks. But even sharks are afraid of whales. A representative from another of Evelyn's shell companies met with them, offering to buy David's debt in full, in cash, immediately. To these lenders, who were growing tired of David's endless excuses, the offer was a miracle. They gladly sold. At the end of 30 days, the campaign was complete. Evelyn sat alone in her office, looking at a single screen. It displayed a diagram of the Vance family's entire financial existence. Every line of credit, every loan, every mortgage, all of it now flowed to a single point at the top of the screen. The name at the top read, simply, Northbridge. She had done it. She had become their bank, their lender, their master. She owned every single one of their obligations. They were living in her house. They were driving her cars. They were surviving on her silent, unacknowledged mercy. The prey had been tracked, isolated, and completely encircled. The beautiful, gilded trap had been set. Now, all she had to do was wait for them to stumble into it. For weeks, Evelyn allowed the silence to stretch. From her vantage point in Chicago, she watched the financial data of the Vance family, her invisible net now cast completely over them. They were blissfully unaware, continuing their lives, borrowing a little more time, believing they were still in control. Then, on a Tuesday morning, with a single, encrypted email to her legal team, she gave the command, "Initiate Phase 2. Apply pressure." The first tremor hit the following Friday. It arrived in a crisp, intimidating envelope via certified mail, bearing the letterhead of a ruthless Manhattan law firm. David Vance signed for it at the door, assuming it was another standard creditor notice. But it wasn't. The letter informed him that the mortgage on his property had been acquired by a private equity fund named Ethelred Holdings, and that due to persistent late payments, the new owners were exercising their right to demand immediate repayment of all arrears within 30 days. Failure to comply would result in the initiation of foreclosure proceedings. The tone was not of a bank, but of a headsman. It was a declaration of war. David's blood ran cold. He had always managed to soothe and delay the local bank, but this was a different beast entirely. This was a faceless corporate entity that could not be charmed or reasoned with. Before he could even fully process the shock, the second and third tremors hit. A different courier arrived with a repossession notice for Marcus's sports car. Simultaneously, the private lenders David had borrowed from the Sharks all called within the same hour, their friendly extensions suddenly revoked, their voices hard as granite, demanding their principal back in full by the end of the month. It was a perfectly coordinated financial blitzkrieg. The Vances were being attacked on all fronts, their lines of credit cut, their assets targeted, their final defenses crumbling. The atmosphere inside the Vance mansion became toxic. The carefully maintained facade of familial affection dissolved, revealing the bitter resentments that had festered for years. Shouting matches erupted in the grand foyer, the acoustics of the house amplifying their rage and despair. "How could you let this happen again, David?" Eleanor would shriek, her voice thin with terror. You promised me we would never be in this position again." David, his pride stripped away, would lash back, his face a blotchy red. "This isn't my fault. The market was unpredictable. If your son knew the meaning of a budget, we wouldn't be in this hole." Marcus, cornered and petulant, would deflect all blame. "So this is my fault now? I'm the one who lost our fortune in the stock market? I didn't see you complaining when my budget was paying for your country club membership, Mother." They were like rats trapped in a sinking ship, turning on each other now that there was no one else to blame. They spent the next few weeks in a frantic, humiliating scramble for survival. David called every old contact in his phone, only to be met with polite dismissals or secretaries who suddenly couldn't find a space in their boss's schedules. Eleanor tried to sell her last few pieces of authentic jewelry, only to be offered a pittance by jewelers who could smell her desperation. They were pariahs. The news of their impending collapse had already begun to circulate through the grapevine of Greenwich society. The foreclosure notice, a bright pink document of official shame, was finally nailed to their ornate front door, a public testament to their ruin. All hope was gone. They sat in the cold, dark living room, the power having been cut off that morning for non-payment, and waited for the end. And then, just as the last ember of hope died, the miracle arrived. It came in the form of another envelope, this one delivered by a high-end courier service addressed to David. The letterhead was elegant and minimalist. The Archway Group, Strategic Real Estate Acquisitions. The letter inside was polite, professional, and utterly astonishing. It stated that the Archway Group, an international real estate investment firm, had identified their property as a high-value asset for their portfolio. It acknowledged the current financial encumbrances on the estate. Then, it made them an offer that seemed to have descended from heaven itself. The Archway Group proposed to purchase the Vance estate outright. The purchase price would be enough to cover the entire outstanding mortgage, as well as every single one of their other documented debts, Marcus's car, David's loans, all of it. In one single transaction, their slate would be wiped clean. But it was the final paragraph that made Eleanor gasp, that made David read the sentence over and over in disbelief. Furthermore, it read, "In recognition of the Vance family's long history with the property, the Archway Group would be pleased to offer the current residents a long-term lease agreement. You would be able to remain in your home, preserving your privacy and standing in the community for a reasonable monthly rent." It was a lifeline. It was an answer to every prayer. It wasn't just a financial rescue, it was a social one. It allowed them to save face. They could tell their friends they had made a clever deal, that they had liquidated an asset to free up capital. They could stay in their home, in their town, and pretend that nothing had changed. The sheer, overwhelming relief was so powerful it blinded them to all reason. They immediately called the number on the letterhead and were put through to a polite, efficient lawyer. A meeting was arranged for the next day. They didn't question the miraculous timing. They didn't wonder why a firm would make such a bizarrely generous offer. They simply saw salvation and ran towards it with open arms. The signing took place in a rented conference room in town. The lawyer representing the Archway Group was smooth and reassuring. He walked them through the paperwork, his tone suggesting it was all a mere formality. "This is a standard purchase agreement," he said, "and this is our standard long-term tenancy contract. It's all boilerplate, really." He gestured to the lease agreement, a thick document of dense legal text. It just outlines the basics: rent, maintenance, responsibilities. There are a few standard clauses about property inspections and utility management to ensure the asset is maintained to our standards. But it's nothing to worry about. David, desperate to reassert himself as the family patriarch and a savvy negotiator, scanned the first page and nodded sagely. "Looks good. It's a solid deal," he announced to his family, as if he had brokered it himself. Eleanor and Marcus, their faces shining with a desperate, euphoric relief, didn't even pretend to read it. They just wanted the nightmare to be over. One by one, they took the pen and signed their names on the indicated lines. The scratch of the nib on the heavy paper was the sound of their surrender. That evening, the signed and executed contract arrived on Evelyn's desk in Chicago. She didn't open it immediately. She let it sit on the polished wood surface, a monument to her victory. She had studied their weaknesses, their pride, their vanity, their fear, and she had crafted a lure so perfect, so tailored to their every desperate desire, that they had taken it without a moment's hesitation. She finally picked up the document, her gloved fingers tracing the signatures. Her father's, an arrogant, self-important scrawl. Her mother's, a delicate, looping script. Her brother's, a careless, hasty slash. The last time a contract had determined her fate, she had been its subject. This time, she was its author. With a chilling lack of emotion, she picked up the phone and dialed her executive assistant. "Clear my schedule for next week," she said, her voice a low, steady hum of command. "And book me a flight to New York. I'm going to visit my new tenants." The trap hadn't just been set. It had been sprung, signed, and delivered. The day their new landlord was scheduled to arrive, a strange, almost festive atmosphere settled over the Vance mansion. It was the energy of survivors, of people who had stared into the abyss and been miraculously pulled back. For the first time in weeks, the oppressive gloom had lifted. David had put on his best suit, a relic from his better days, and stood by the fireplace, practicing a speech of gratitude and partnership. Eleanor had managed to find a florist who would give her an arrangement of lilies on credit, and they now sat on the grand foyer table, a fragrant symbol of their second chance. Marcus had even bothered to shave, and he paced the living room, already talking about how this new stability would allow him to finally get his next brilliant business idea off the ground. They were not preparing to meet a landlord. They were preparing to greet their savior, a faceless representative of the Archway Group, who had, for some inexplicable reason, chosen to bless them. They were ready to perform, to be the charming, dignified family worthy of such a miracle. The sound that announced the arrival was the first thing that felt wrong. It wasn't the sound of a normal car. It was a low, electric hum, a whisper of immense, silent power that seemed to vibrate in the air. David peered out the window. A car, long and black as polished obsidian, had glided to a stop at the end of the driveway. It wasn't a corporate sedan. It was the kind of vehicle reserved for heads of state and billionaires. A chauffeur in a crisp, gray uniform emerged from the driver's side and walked silently to open the rear passenger door. The Vances gathered in the foyer, their curiosity piqued, their planned performance momentarily forgotten. They expected a man, probably an older, dry lawyer, or a young, ambitious executive. Instead, a woman emerged. They saw her silhouette first against the bright afternoon light. She was tall and slender, dressed in a charcoal gray coat, with lines so sharp it looked like it had been cut from steel. Her shoes, as she stepped onto the gravel, made a soft, expensive crunch. She moved with a deliberate, unhurried grace, a predator's economy of motion. As she approached the house, her features came into focus. Her hair was cut in a severe, dark bob. Her face was pale, her expression utterly neutral, shielded by a pair of dark, impassive sunglasses. Eleanor squinted. "Goodness," she whispered to David. "Who is that? She looks so familiar." The woman paused on the top step, removed her sunglasses, and looked at them. Her eyes were the color of a winter sky, and they held the weight of 15 years of a cold, controlled fire. For a moment, there was only the sound of the wind in the trees. The Vances stared, their brains refusing to assemble the information their eyes were providing. The face was the face of a stranger, harder and more confident than any they had known, but the eyes were a ghost. Marcus was the first to break the silence. A choked, strangled sound escaped his lips. "No," he whispered. "It can't be." David's face, which had been arranged in a welcoming smile, froze and then began to crumble. Eleanor brought a hand to her mouth, her own face a mask of horrified disbelief. And then the woman spoke. Her voice was not the voice of the timid girl they remembered. It was lower, smoother, and coated in a layer of absolute authority. "Hello, Father," she said, her gaze fixed on David. "Mother." She turned her eyes to Eleanor. "Marcus." It was Alara. But it wasn't. It was as if the ghost of their daughter had possessed the body of a powerful, terrifying stranger. "What? What is this?" David stammered, taking a stumbling step back. "Alara? What are you doing here? How did you—" "I believe you were expecting the new owner of the property," she said, cutting him off. She stepped over the threshold into the foyer, her presence immediately commanding the entire space. She reached into a slim leather portfolio she carried and produced a single document. "I am Evelyn Reed," she stated, her voice echoing slightly in the large hall. "Founder and sole proprietor of Northbridge Equity Partners, the parent company of the Archway Group." She paused, letting the words sink in, watching the blood drain from their faces. "I am your new landlord." She then produced a second document, a copy of the lease agreement they had so eagerly signed the day before. "And this," she continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "is the legally binding contract that governs the terms of your tenancy in my house." The silence that followed was thick with the weight of their catastrophic miscalculation. The miracle, their salvation, was in fact the architect of their ruin. The trap had been so perfect, so complete, that they had not only walked into it, they had signed the deed to their own cage. Eleanor was the first to find her voice, a high-pitched, desperate wail. "Alara, baby, no. You can't do this. We're your family." Evelyn looked at her mother, her expression not changing by so much as a flicker. "You ceased to be my family the day you sold me to Alistair Sterling to pay for your social calendar," she said, her voice devoid of heat, stating it as a simple, inarguable fact. "This is not a family reunion. This is a business transaction. And our first order of business is the initial property inspection, as stipulated in Section 7B of your lease." Without waiting for a response, she began to walk through the living room. Her movements were slow, her eyes scanning every detail with the cold appraisal of a building inspector. "The upholstery on this sofa is frayed," she commented to the empty air. "And there's water damage on the ceiling in the corner. That will be noted." She ran a gloved finger along a dusty side table. "The property is not being maintained to an acceptable standard. You'll want to rectify that." David finally found his voice, a weak, sputtering rage. "Now, you listen here, Alara. My name is Evelyn Reed," she corrected him, turning to face him fully. "And you will address me as Miss Reed. As your landlord, I am exercising my right under Clause 11C of the lease to manage the property's utilities to ensure asset preservation. From now on, the thermostat will be set and locked at 65 degrees during the winter months to prevent unnecessary wear on the heating system." They could only stare at her, their minds reeling, the full, horrifying scope of their situation finally dawning on them. This was not about money, this was about power. This was about a meticulous, cold, and deeply personal revenge that was only just beginning. She had not come to evict them. She had come to rule them. Their home was no longer a sanctuary. It was her chessboard, and they were merely the pawns. Evelyn finished her slow circuit of the ground floor. She stood before them in the foyer, the three of them looking like wax figures in a museum of their own failure. "The rent is due on the 1st of every month. No delays," she said. "I will be back tomorrow at 10 a.m. to inspect the upstairs. Have a pleasant evening." She turned and walked out the door, as calmly as she had entered. They watched, paralyzed, as she got into the back of the silent black car. As it glided away down the driveway, Eleanor finally let out a true scream, a raw, animal sound of pure despair that was swallowed by the sudden, crushing silence of the house they no longer owned. The play had begun. The days that followed the revelation were a masterclass in psychological warfare, a slow, methodical dismantling of the Vance family's spirit, conducted with the chilling precision of a surgeon. Evelyn did not resort to shouting or overt cruelty. She didn't have to. She had a far more potent weapon, the lease agreement they had so willingly signed. It was their Bible of suffering, and she was its new, unyielding God. Her revenge was not a raging fire, but the slow, inexorable advance of a glacier grinding down everything in its path. The first instrument of her torment was the cold. As autumn bled into the harsh New England winter, the grand old mansion, with its drafty windows and high ceilings, became an icebox. True to her word, Evelyn had a tamper-proof, locked case installed over the thermostat, the temperature permanently set to a brisk 65 degrees. The Vances began to live in layers of sweaters and blankets, their breath misting in the mornings. The cold was a constant, physical reminder of their powerlessness. It seeped into their bones, making them feel like impoverished ghosts in the museum of their former lives. David, in a fit of impotent rage, tried to pry the box off the wall one night, only to trigger a silent alarm that resulted in a formal warning letter from Miss Reed's lawyers and a $200 fine for willful damage to property, an amount they had to borrow from a friend to pay. Next, she came for Eleanor's sanctuary, her garden. For years, Eleanor's one true passion had been her award-winning rose garden. It was her legacy, a place of beauty and order she had cultivated herself. One morning, she looked out the window to see a team of commercial landscapers swarming her beloved garden. They were not gardeners, they were executioners. Armed with chainsaws and industrial shears, they moved with brutal efficiency. When Eleanor ran outside, hysterical, the foreman simply handed her a work order signed by Evelyn Reed, property owner. The reason cited was overgrowth and non-compliance with local property insurance liability standards. He explained, with no emotion, that the rose bushes were a security risk and the overgrown flower beds a potential fire hazard. Eleanor could only watch, sobbing, as they reduced 30 years of her life's work to a bed of mulch and sawdust in under 2 hours. They left behind a barren, uniform patch of dirt. Evelyn had not just destroyed her garden. She had erased a part of Eleanor's identity. The inspections were the cruelest part of the performance. They were random, unannounced, and always at the most humiliating times. The Vances had managed to cling to a few of their old social connections, and one evening, they hosted a small, desperate dinner party for 2 other couples, a pathetic attempt to pretend that their lives were still normal. They were just serving the main course when the doorbell chimed. It was Evelyn. She was dressed in a sharp, black suit, holding a clipboard. "I'm here for a spot inspection," she announced coolly, stepping past the horrified David and into the dining room. She paid no attention to their stunned guests. She simply walked around the room, making notes. "Scuff marks on the wainscoting," she'd say to no one in particular. "There's a wine stain on the rug. You'll be receiving a bill for the professional cleaning." She proceeded to tour the entire ground floor, her presence sucking all the air and life from the party. She would open cupboards in the kitchen, check the seals on the windows, all while their guests sat in mortified silence. Within 15 minutes, the guests were making their hurried, awkward excuses, fleeing the house as if it were contaminated. The party was ruined. Their last social lifeline had been severed. Evelyn had successfully isolated them, turning their home into a permanent quarantine zone of shame. The smaller torments were a constant, grinding attrition. A faucet in the upstairs bathroom began to drip, a maddening, incessant sound that echoed through the quiet house at night. Their written request for a plumber, submitted on the required form, was answered a month later with a letter stating that the request was under review. The dripping continued. Marcus, driven to the edge of sanity by the sound, tried to fix it himself and ended up breaking the pipe, causing a small flood. The subsequent repair bill from Evelyn's approved vendor was astronomical. They were trapped in a state of managed decay. Through it all, Evelyn remained a distant, untouchable force. She was in Chicago, running her empire, orchestrating their suffering with the same detached efficiency she applied to a corporate acquisition. She reviewed the reports from her property manager in Greenwich. She signed the landscaping work orders and approved the fines for lease violations. She was treating their lives as a line item on a balance sheet, a distressed asset to be managed. The coldness of the process was the heart of its cruelty. Her revenge was not emotional, it was administrative. By the time the first snows of winter began to fall, the Vances were broken. The fight had gone out of them, replaced by a dull, hollow-eyed despair. David, once so proud, now shuffled through the halls like a defeated old man. Eleanor spent most of her days in her room, staring at her ruined garden, occasionally weeping without a sound. Marcus, stripped of his car, his friends, and his ego, paced his room like a caged animal, his impotent fury curdling into a bitter, toxic resentment. The slow burn had worked. Evelyn had not just taken their house. She had methodically stripped them of their pride, their identity, and their will to fight. They were hollowed-out shells, living in a cold, beautiful prison of her design, haunted by the ghost of the daughter they had betrayed. They were at the absolute bottom, with nothing left to lose. And it was there, in that pit of absolute desperation, that the final, ugly truth was waiting to be exhumed. The breaking point arrived on a frigid December morning in an envelope marked Final Notice. It was an official eviction order. The legal language was cold and precise, citing numerous lease violations, including the unauthorized pipe repair by Marcus and a general failure to maintain the property in a condition befitting its value. It gave them 30 days. They were to vacate the premises by January 15th. Evelyn was not just tormenting them anymore. She was casting them out. The finality of it was absolute. There were no more appeals to be made, no more time to be bought. This was the end of the line. To be thrown out of their home in the dead of winter was not just a financial catastrophe. It was the ultimate social execution. It was the final, public stripping of the Vance name. That night, huddled in the freezing living room, the three of them came to a silent, desperate consensus. They had nothing left to lose. The lawyers wouldn't help them. There was only one person who could reverse this, and she had to be confronted. Not as a landlord, but as a daughter. It was their last, most pathetic card to play, and they knew they had to play it. They learned from a curt phone call to the property management office that Miss Reed was scheduled for a final property assessment before the eviction. They didn't know the exact day, so they waited. For 3 days, they kept a frantic vigil, living on coffee and adrenaline, watching the driveway like prisoners on death row, watching for the governor's messenger. She arrived on the 4th day, her black car gliding silently through the falling snow. She was not expecting them. She expected a quiet, empty house, her tenants subdued and defeated. Instead, she found the three of them waiting for her in the grand foyer, standing together, blocking her path. They looked like figures from a tragedy. David, gaunt and gray. Eleanor, her face puffy from days of crying. Marcus, vibrating with a tense, cornered, animal energy. They were a stark, pathetic contrast to Evelyn, who stood before them in a long cashmere coat, the picture of untouchable power. "This is not a scheduled appointment," she said, her voice clipping the cold air. "Step aside. I'm here to conduct my assessment." David took a shaky step forward, holding up his hands in a gesture of placation. "Alara, please," he began, his voice cracking. "We need to talk, just for a moment. As a family." A look of utter contempt crossed Evelyn's face. "We are not a family, David," she replied, her voice like ice. "A family does not sell its children. We are two parties in a business contract that you have violated. Now, step aside." She made to move past them, but Marcus blocked her way, his face contorted in a sneer of long-simmering resentment. "So that's it?" he spat. "You're just going to kick us out into the snow? After everything you've done? You come back here with all his money, our money, really, and you destroy our lives just to feel powerful? You're a monster, a cold-hearted monster." Evelyn didn't even flinch at the insult. She looked at her brother as if he were a mildly irritating insect. "I didn't take your lives," she said calmly. "I simply held up a mirror, and you didn't like the reflection. Everything that has happened to you, you have done to yourselves. Your weakness is not my responsibility." It was then that Eleanor fell apart. The last shred of her pride, her composure, everything she had clung to, disintegrated. She fell to her knees on the cold marble floor, her hands clasped together, her face a mess of tears and desperation. "Please, Alara," she sobbed, the sound echoing in the vast, empty hall. "My baby, please, don't do this to us. Don't throw us out. It's all we have left. I'm begging you. I'm on my knees begging you. Whatever we did, we're sorry. Please, have mercy." The sight of her mother, once so proud and powerful, now a crumpled, begging heap on the floor, did nothing to move Evelyn. Her expression remained one of cold, detached finality. This was the moment she had envisioned for 15 years. Their total and complete surrender. Her victory was absolute. "Mercy?" she said, the word sounding alien in her mouth. "You speak to me of mercy? You had a daughter who begged you for the same thing in this very room, and your answer was to sign a contract. Well, I have a contract too. It's time for you to honor it." She looked down at her mother one last time. "Get up, Eleanor. You're embarrassing yourself." She turned her back on them then, her victory complete, the conversation over. She was about to walk away, to leave them in the ruins she had so meticulously crafted, when a sound ripped through the air, a sound so full of raw, primal fury, it made her freeze in her tracks. "You know nothing," Eleanor screamed, rising from the floor, her face transformed from one of pleading to one of incandescent rage. "You stand there in your castle of judgment, so clean and righteous. You think this was about pride? About a house? About keeping up with the neighbors? You sanctimonious little fool. You have no idea what real sacrifice is." David rushed to her side, his eyes wide with panic. "Eleanor, for God's sake, stop it. Don't." But Eleanor pushed him away, her eyes locked on Evelyn's back, a dam of 15 years of secrets finally bursting. "No, I will not stop. She will hear it. She wants justice. Then let her have the whole truth." She took a step towards Evelyn, her voice dropping to a venomous, trembling hiss. "You think we needed Sterling's money for ourselves? We did it for him. We sacrificed you to save him. We did it all for Marcus." The words struck Evelyn with the force of a physical blow. Her entire body went rigid. Every calculation she had ever made, every assumption that had fueled her 15-year quest for revenge, was based on a single, simple premise: her family's greed. This was a variable she had never accounted for. This was a piece from a different puzzle, and its sudden appearance threatened to shatter the entire picture she had so carefully constructed. The icy composure she had worn like armor, for a decade, cracked. Slowly, she turned around. The mask of the powerful CEO, the cold landlord, the vengeful daughter, was gone. Her face was stripped bare, revealing a raw, stunned vulnerability she hadn't shown since she was a girl. Her eyes, wide with a confusion that bordered on fear, were locked on her mother. The power dynamic in the room had not just shifted, it had been obliterated. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was not a command. It was a broken, terrified whisper, a question that demanded an answer that could unravel her entire world. "What?" she asked, each word a shard of glass. "Did you do for Marcus?" Evelyn's question hung in the frozen air of the foyer, a demand that shattered 15 years of silence. For a moment, no one spoke. David looked pale, defeated, while Marcus seemed to shrink into himself, the weight of his mother's words physically crushing him. It was Eleanor who finally answered, the dam of her long-held secret now completely broken. The words came tumbling out, a messy, frantic torrent of confession, justification, and unbearable grief. "He was sick, Ilara," she began, her voice a raw whisper, "when he was a teenager. The doctors here, they didn't know what it was at first. Headaches, fatigue, losing his balance. They thought it was nothing, but it got worse." David picked up the thread, his voice hollow, the voice of a man reciting a nightmare he had memorized. It was a rare genetic disorder, degenerative. The doctors gave him 5 years, maybe less. They told us there was nothing they could do. As he spoke, the memory replayed in Evelyn's mind. Marcus, once the star athlete, suddenly quitting the football team. Marcus, spending more and more time in his room, the family explaining it away as him studying. All the small inconsistencies she had noticed but never understood. But there was one hope, Eleanor continued, her eyes wild with the memory of that desperation. An experimental treatment. A new gene therapy, only available at a private clinic in Switzerland. It wasn't approved. No insurance in the world would touch it, but it was a cure. A real cure. The cost, she choked on the word, was astronomical. It was more than we had, more than we could ever borrow. It was the exact moment your father's investments collapsed. We were ruined, and our son was dying. The pieces of the puzzle began to slam into place in Evelyn's mind, forming a picture far more monstrous than she had ever imagined. The timeline, the desperation, the sudden appearance of Alistair Sterling and his limitless funds. "So you made a choice," Evelyn said, her voice dangerously quiet. She wasn't asking a question, she was stating the horrifying conclusion. "It wasn't a choice," Eleanor screamed, the lie sounding thin even to her own ears. "It was a calculation. We had one child who was certainly going to die, and another who was healthy and beautiful, with her whole life ahead of her. Sterling's offer. It wasn't just money, it was Marcus's life, handed to us on a silver platter. We took the certain path. We saved the son we were about to lose. We sacrificed your future to guarantee his." The ugly, simple truth was finally laid bare. They had looked at their two children and weighed their lives on a scale, and she, Ilara, had been found wanting. It was not a betrayal born of simple greed for a bigger house or a better car. It was a betrayal born of a twisted, monstrous form of love, a triage of the soul that had doomed one child to save the other. Evelyn's world tilted on its axis. The entire architecture of her revenge, so meticulously constructed over 15 years, was built on the foundation of their selfishness. But this new truth was a seismic shock that fractured that foundation beyond repair. Her anger, the cold, pure, righteous fury that had been the engine of her life, suddenly had nowhere to go. Who was the villain in this story? Was it the parents who made an unspeakable choice? Was it the brother who lived, breathing the air his sister's freedom had paid for? Or was it her, the architect of a perfect and terrible justice for a crime she had never truly understood? The fire that had fueled her for a decade was gone, extinguished by this horrifying truth. In its place was a vast, silent, and chilling emptiness. The victory she had achieved felt grotesque. The mansion around her was no longer a symbol of her triumph, but a monument to her family's tragedy, a mausoleum for a choice that had destroyed them all in different ways. She looked at the three broken people before her. Her father, a weak man who had hidden behind a monstrous decision. Her mother, a woman whose fierce love for one child had made her a monster to the other. And her brother, the golden boy, now pale and trembling, his life a testament to a debt he could never repay. Her meticulously planned justice felt like a childish tantrum in the face of such a complex, profound horror. She had won, but she had lost. She had gotten her revenge, but it had turned to ash in her mouth. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the first she had taken in 15 years that wasn't sharpened by the edge of anger. She looked at them one last time, seeing them not as enemies, but as the pathetic, tragic figures they were. "The eviction is canceled," she said, the words falling like stones into the silence. "Keep the house." They all looked up, stunned. "It's what you bought with me," she continued, her voice hollow. "It's the price you paid for him. Live in it. Live with what you did here, every single day." Without another word, she turned and walked away. This time, no one tried to stop her. She stepped out into the falling snow, each step feeling strangely light, untethered. She got into the back of her waiting car, the door closing with a soft, final thud, sealing her away from the wreckage of her past. The chauffeur looked at her in the rearview mirror. "Where to, miss?" "Reed?" he asked. And for the first time in 10 years, the woman who had a plan for everything, who controlled empires and commanded fortunes, had absolutely no answer. She was powerful, she was wealthy, she was free, and she was completely and utterly lost. Never underestimate the silence of a person who has endured for too long, for when they finally speak, their voice can shatter the foundations of the world you thought you knew. But sometimes, the truth doesn't set you free. Sometimes, It just builds a more complex and lonelier cage. A verdict has been reached, but the sentence is a life term for all involved. Join us next time for another story.